Great. Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. My name's Arnav Joshi. I'm a senior technology lawyer at Clifford Chance. I have, over the past 7 years or so, been lucky enough to have worked in this space as a student, then as a researcher, and also as an advisor, which is the role that I play now. In that time, I think I've grown to approach the field of AI with a mix of cautious optimism, and I guess what I would define as measured realism. That said, although winter is no doubt coming outside of these windows, it feels like even an army of invincible White Walkers can't put a freeze on AI in the months and years ahead. So if we are headed for a long and prosperous AI summer, what is it that we need to do to ensure that we can embrace it in a sustainable, safe, and ethical way? You will have heard perspectives on international approaches to governance and regulation and what we need to do to get to common landing grounds on these themes on other panels this morning. One area that has emerged as a critical piece of the AI governance puzzle, as it has in a number of other arguably infrastructuralized pieces of technology before it, is the role of standards and assurance. In this country, the government's AI white paper will likely form the blueprint of how the UK governs AI in the years ahead. It outlines a pro-innovation approach to AI, aiming to foster responsible development and adoption of AI while safeguarding public trust, addressing potential risks, and dealing with principles like transparency, fairness, and accountability. Standards play a pivotal role in providing a common framework for AI development, ensuring consistency, interoperability, and compliance with law. Establishing clear and well-accepted standards can help us promote responsible AI practices across industries and geographical boundaries. AI assurance encompasses a range of techniques that provide confidence in the trustworthiness and reliability of the AI systems we develop and use. It involves assessing AI systems against established principles, guidelines, and standards, ensuring that they're designed, developed, and deployed responsibly. Lastly, AI auditing is a key component of AI assurance and involves the independent evaluation of AI systems to verify their compliance with regulatory requirements, with ethical principles, internal controls, and with industry best practice. This panel discussion would delve into the practical aspects of AI assurance of audits and standards, exploring how these enablers can effectively translate the AI white paper's principles into actionable measures. We will hear from experts in the field who will share their insights on the development and implementation of AI standards and frameworks, in the role of AI auditing and regulatory oversight, and the importance of standards in fostering responsible AI innovation. The panel will also discuss these tools and whether they are currently sufficiently integrated and acknowledged in the AI white paper, whether we're doing enough to ensure that they're being effectively utilized across organizations developing and deploying artificial intelligence, and if not, what more needs to happen and by whom. Finally, following the recent launch of the UK's AI Safety Institute, the panel will consider the next steps needed to ensure the UK's AI emerging landscape in AI, the AI assurance and safety market can continue to grow and flourish. With that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Eliot to kick us off and introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Arnav. I'm Eliot Cohen, and I'm an associate at Clifford Chance working in tech and privacy. And I'm very happy to be joined by three panelists. We've got Felicity Burch, who is the Executive Director of the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, CDEI. Previously, Felicity was the Director of Innovation and Digital at the Confederation of British Industry, where she led the CBI's work to create the conditions to enable businesses to innovate. She also spearheaded the CBI's work to ensure trust, accountability, and diversity in the development and delivery of technology, working on issues including the ethical use of AI. We have Emre Kazim, who is the co-chief executive officer and co-founder of Holistic AI, which is a startup focusing on software for auditing and risk management of AI systems. So it's very solidly in the AI assurance world. Emre is also a research fellow in computer science at UCL. And joining us virtually, we have Florian Ostmann, who is the head of AI governance and regulatory innovation at the Alan Turing Institute. Florian leads Turing's work on the AI Standards Hub and international engagement around standardization for AI technology. More broadly, his work and areas of expertise include regulation and non-regulatory governance mechanisms related to AI, as well as the use of AI to facilitate the work of regulatory bodies. So thank you all for joining me today for what will hopefully be a fascinating discussion about the concrete steps that need to be taken to ensure that the UK's tech market, and specifically in the realm of AI assurance techniques and tools, can continue to grow and flourish. AI assurance techniques, as we're going to hear, are crucial for supporting the development of trustworthy AI and answers the how question for testing whether an AI system actually achieves regulatory outcomes. An AI assurance ecosystem has been estimated to be potentially worth nearly £4 billion for the UK economy. So it's going to be very important to ensure that we're exploring properly how AI assurance techniques and standards fit into the wider realm of AI governance, which can include certification, can also include third-party audits, and also enable the responsible adoption of AI. So I'm excited to hear and learn from all of you three today. I'd like to kick off with just an opening question for each of you. Before exploring the issues in more detail, it would be great to kind of take a step back and ask a foundational question that will hopefully set the scene for the whole audience here. What does assurance mean to you, and why is it specifically important for AI systems? And for me, how do you think it differs from auditing? So if we start with Felicity.
Yeah, very, very happy to. And perhaps I'm going to take an even bigger step back and sort of say, well, why does this matter in the first place? And at CDI, I often talk about our mission as enabling trustworthy innovation in data and AI. We all know, of course, that's why we're here in this room, that there are massive opportunities from data-driven innovation, from AI-driven innovation. We also know that there are really big risks associated with that as well. And the general public knows this too. I'm going to do my first plug of the day and say the CDI has published our Wave 3 Public Attitudes Tracker survey today, which delves a little bit into how the public are feeling about AI and data-driven technology at the moment. And the truth is, while the public do see opportunities around these technologies, they're also quite nervous about them. They're nervous about data security, privacy. They're anxious about sort of fair outcomes across society, and sort of people who sort of know less about data and AI are often more concerned. But actually, we've seen the sort of proliferation of conversation around things like ChatGPT has led to people sort of thinking about this a bit more and sort of becoming more deeply concerned about the way AI is ingrained in society. And I think many of these concerns that people have are legitimate, but what the research also shows is that where people feel there is accountability, there is transparency, and there are the right systems in place, they're much more likely to trust these products and services. And fundamentally, this point about trust comes up time and time again. And not just, do you trust the system, but is it trustworthy? And assurance tools are a way to measure, to evaluate, and to communicate whether those tools are trustworthy. You mentioned audit sort of specifically. I think audit is a really useful tool. I sort of see it as a tool within the toolbox for AI assurance. And actually, you have a much sort of wider range of tools that you might want to use and deploy. So, sort of thinking about your governance techniques, technical techniques, and sort of more informal mechanisms as well. But audit is definitely one of them, but just sort of part of that kind of wider picture.
Thank you. Emre?
Awesome. Thank you for introducing us. Thanks, everyone, for being here. And thank you, Arnav, for arranging this. So actually, really at the core of this, I'm no longer at UCL. I'm a kind of honorary position there now. But I actually ended up in the computer science department after finishing my PhD in philosophy. And there was a real desire in the computer science department to have a non-engineer around. They tried to bring in some lawyers and sociologists, and they said, we're having a nightmare. So I had done my undergraduate, postgraduate in chemistry and physics, so they said at least he's technology literate. So the kind of core problem, intellectual problem, if you will, that we were trying to solve was, how do you meaningfully interrogate the algorithms, the technology itself, but with a view to non-engineers. So it could be C-suite, it could be regulators, it could be the society writ large. And that was the kind of core problem that we were trying to solve. And we thought that the way we're going to solve this problem was kind of create some kind of certification standard. People could meet that standard, and then great, we've got trustworthiness, if you will. And actually what happened was pretty quickly we realized that, God, what does it mean to even interrogate an algorithm? What does it even mean to kind of do a risk assessment or an audit of an algorithm? So we were doing highly speculative work at that time. And the kind of core problem that we were trying to solve from our view in terms of assurance was trust with respect to the society writ large. So assurance for me is very much that. From an industry perspective, what we see is, hey, you know what? Damned if we do and damned if we don't. So if companies don't automate, they won't remain competitive. We're in the middle of an industrial revolution. We're seeing an exponential adoption in the use of AI. We're seeing almost every few months or so these kind of extraordinary events in terms of technology innovation and development. So these companies are like, oh God, they're getting this massive amount of pressure from right in the top to say, you've got to automate, we got to do this, we don't want to be left behind. And then the flip side of that is, so if they don't automate, they don't remain competitive. The opposite side of that is that when they automate or they introduce AI, they introduce these kind of existential threats into their business. And we can see that in terms of, from the trading systems that a minor glitch wipes out 440 million from Knight Capital. You've got these horrible kind of reputational damage for systems that are shown to be horribly biased against different demographics and so on and so forth. So from an industry perspective, if you will, assurance is very much about mediating that risk. It's about the innovation and adoption of AI in their business.
Thank you. Florian?
Yeah, thank you. I think Felicity and Emre put it very eloquently, and I agree with all of those points. And I think there are different ways of slicing the cake when it comes to defining assurance versus auditing. There's of course a question, what's the role of third parties in each? Sometimes people might think of auditing as by definition involving third parties, assurance not necessarily so, but I don't think that's necessarily the case. Of course, there's third party assurance, there's third party auditing. I think one thing that stands out to me intuitively, if you think about the meaning of the terms, is that auditing is quite a formal term. What auditing essentially entails is assessing practices against a certain objective, but it doesn't really say anything about what those objectives are. Whereas assurance is quite a value-laden term. It's an act of providing confidence-building activity, and an act of providing assurance in the sense of creating confidence. And I think that's, to me, sort of intuitively and maybe also to some extent emotively stands out. And I think that's why assurance is the more powerful term and the more operational term, as an activity that's intrinsically motivated to create trustworthiness, to create safety, fostering practices. But yeah, I think there is of course overlap and one other consideration to add potentially is that in the auditing context, I think there are areas of practice where auditing is thought of as more narrowly focused on properties of systems. So auditing a model, examining a model, examining the relationship between inputs and outputs, whereas assurance might sometimes be thought of as being broader than that and including processes of governance, of risk management, and so on. Thinking about the social context in which models are developed and deployed, rather than just the properties of the model or the system itself.
Thank you. In June this year, the UK CDEI published a portfolio of AI assurance techniques, which showcases examples of techniques being used in the real world to support the development of trustworthy AI. And Holistic AI, indeed, actually provided a few of those case studies, which you can look up online. And the CDEI's portfolio also overlaps internationally with the OECD's catalogue of tools and metrics for trustworthy AI. So what I'm interested in hearing from you all is kind of, how do you suggest that we take what already exists globally, but also in the UK, forward to meet the UK's ambitions to be a global leader, as we heard from Arnav? And who needs to be involved? Are the right people already involved? I mean, obviously the CDEI is there, Holistic AI is there, Turing is at the forefront, so everyone on this panel is involved, but is there anyone missing in your opinion? I don't know, maybe if we start with you, Felicity, and then we hear from Emre.
Well, thanks for the plug for the the portfolio of assurance techniques, and you bring me on to my second plug of the day. Sorry, this isn't a sales pitch, but I think one of the things that came across sort of loud and clear from industry, and I was talking about it at this summit last year, is that while assurance techniques aren't themselves new, they're used in lots and lots of industries. What good assurance techniques look like in an AI context is still being defined. And the reason that we wanted to pull together the portfolio, and we worked with techUK and indeed others on this panel to pull it together, was exactly to sort of demonstrate what current good practice looks like, and we're so glad to have examples from Holistic AI as part of that. But I think from our perspective, there's probably a couple of things to think about. One is how do we keep that up to date? So we will be publishing the next sort of batch of examples next week. Keep an eye out for that. And we're also planning on doing it on a bit more of a sort of sector by sector basis, because we imagine sort of different sectors and different contexts will have sort of different priorities when it comes to assurance. We're currently considering financial services and public sector, but if you do have other ideas or sectors that you think we should prioritise, I'm definitely sort of keen to hear where the sort of biggest risks and opportunities are from the perspectives of people around this room. So I think one is just kind of keeping those sort of set of examples up to date. And then the other thing, and I think a really sort of challenging frontier for assurance, is we're definitely seeing the growth of technical assurance and sort of being able to sort of measure things like bias, for example. But I think one of the things that we see as a particular challenge when it comes to AI is the sort of socio-technical elements of it, and how do you sort of assure for fairness, for example, beyond just being able to measure, well, this tool seems to have the right outcomes no matter what your protected characteristics are, versus when this is deployed in the real world. Like, how does this then impact people? Have you put the right sort of governance and all of that around it? Which is why we currently have our Fairness Innovation Challenge open for entries for people. Open until just next week, actually. So also, sorry, third plug, I'm done now. But we're really looking for sort of industry, regulators, and indeed government to sort of come together and try and answer some of these sort of socio-technical challenges. And I do think that's a particular issue when it comes to both assuring and regulating AI.
Thanks. Emre, also, I'd love to hear about some of those examples that Holistic AI have put out there, if you want to share any details there.
Sure. Also, just to kind of situate this, our very, very early work while we were still at UCL was actually commissioned by the CDEI. And it was really and I remember at the time asking about the scope of it and saying, are these you're asking us to do audits, is this to do some kind of inspection? And the answer was, no, we just want to know what it looks like. And actually, interestingly, so I'm based in the US, I'm in San Francisco, and I was in DC for the executive order. So it was kind of weird crossover. And I was just constantly being asked to brief, how do you do this? So I think like the UK, sometimes we kind of bash ourselves a little bit, but on the international scene, we're seen as kind of leading in this space, and very much from a kind of empiricist perspective. So the kind of publication of these techniques, I understand from a kind of a public sector perspective, is just to kind of showcase this. But under the hood, if you will, the interest that people have in a lot of what we're doing here in the UK, or groups that have come out of the UK, is what does it look like to do this in practice? What is the kind of evidence base for what a good kind of audit looks like and what it doesn't look like? Some of our policy team are here today, and they're just constantly being bombarded by different kind of regulatory bodies and standard bodies around the world, in Brussels, in the US, and so on, about what does it actually look like in practice. So I think really kind of it goes back really kind of philosophically to us as a nation in terms of the way we approach policy and law, is very much that kind of common law approach, or that kind of empiricist approach really kind of puts us right at the forefront. So what we found is there are different classes of problems that do translate quite well. So if you're talking about bias in medicine, it's different to bias, let's say, in credit scoring. But credit scoring, recruitment, fraud detection, and so on is a kind of, what you start to see is kind of clusters. So it's not that you have to do, if you will, a bespoke solution every single time you see an algorithmic system or you audit an algorithmic system, but more generally, you're starting to see kind of classes of problems. when you do so many audits, God knows how many we've done, you start to see patterns, the same kind of problems emerge. A big kind of, so we are starting to see, if you will, a kind of best practice emerge or kind of themes emerge in this kind of industry. The way we see it is probably the next 3-4 years is very much about get your frameworks in place, evidence that you care about these things. And then probably towards the end of the decade, we'll have codification of best practice and the kind of really robust standards. So it's really kind of from a UK perspective, I think we're the best in class. I think we're doing really well. I think we need to kind of assert ourselves far more kind of aggressively on the international scene and very much say, we know what we're doing. We've done this before. And this is a kind of legacy industry that we can just extend to AI.
Thank you. And yeah, mentioning the executive order on AI from Biden is interesting because one of the notable things there was that they're funding independent and non-industry-led AI research. So it helps to kind of take this research outside the confines of private industry and commercial value. And obviously in November this year, we heard about the announcement of the UK's AI Safety Institute, which is quite exciting for the UK and puts us on the map. And it's focused on advanced AI safety and the public interest there. And it will develop and run system evaluations, and it will work in partnership with external organizations. So Florian, as someone in the Turing Institute, often operating internationally and working in those spaces for international standardization, yeah, what are your thoughts on kind of who needs to be involved and where we're currently at?
Yes, so thank you. I think maybe I'll start briefly with a comment that also links back to the previous question around, the work that's been happening in the UK and how it relates to, international developments. I think what we can really be proud of, sort of on the UK side, is the systematic thinking and the holistic thinking around what's needed to achieve, a mature AI ecosystem. And of course, in no small part, a lot of that is rooted in the important work that the CDI has been doing, and that, going back to the assurance roadmap, the roadmap for AI assurance that was published a couple of years ago, and that, also gave rise to the AI Standards Hub, among other things, which I'll say more about in a moment. But I think you mentioned, the various international initiatives that have also come about and emerged. And it's quite clear, I think, that it's important for, what we do in the UK to be aligned and also to link up to, international initiatives. So you mentioned, the database that the OECD are developing around metrics and tools for trustworthy AI, and we're working very closely with them from the AI Standards Hub. And I know that CDI are doing the same to ensure that, we share data and we make sure the catalogs map onto each other. I think sort of the holistic nature and, thinking about different elements of the ecosystem, different pieces that have emerged in the UK, that's quite unique, that sort of breadth of thinking around the different elements. And maybe I'll just say a bit more about one of these elements, which are standards, which is, a large of the work that we're focused on together with our two other partners on the AI Standards Hub, the British Standards Institution and the National Physical Laboratory. So that initiative, and many of you in the room, will have heard about it, and hopefully have attended some of our events and made use of our resources, is very much dedicated to the field of international standardization of AI, so the kinds of standards developed in ISO, for example, or IEEE, but also now, importantly, at the EU level, for example, the European level, the harmonized standards that will be developed in support of the EU AI Act, and for which the UK is still providing input, still has a seat at the table, which is a little known fact in some circles in the UK, but a really important fact. So those standards, as Emre mentioned, are largely still at a relatively early stage. So the standards that have been published so far are mostly focused around setting out terminologies and are now starting to move into the field of process frameworks and management frameworks. What will take a bit more time are the kinds of things that Emre mentioned, concrete metrics and sort of performance benchmarks, but that will be coming. And what we're trying to do with the hub, and what I think is really important for this field to advance and mature as quickly as it can, is to really make sure that all stakeholders and all relevant voices are sufficiently represented and included in that process of developing relevant standards. So we know, for example, that in the AI ecosystem, if you think about the ecosystem and the sort of locus of innovation. Of course, startups in the AI ecosystem play a really important role. But contributing to international standards development efforts isn't necessarily at the forefront of a startup founder, given sort of resource constraints and the priorities of keeping the company growing and in business. Similarly, regulators often have a difficult time following standards processes. Civil society is often far less engaged than we think it would ideally be. And so there is a strong need, I think, and a strong case to increase sort of the momentum around the field of standardization and sort of try to realize its contribution to achieve a mature assurance ecosystem. So one of the challenges, of course, currently in the assurance ecosystem is that we've seen rapid growth in service providers, which is great, but there aren't necessarily comparable frameworks. So users of assurance services might find it quite difficult to judge, how one service provider's offerings compare to another service provider's offerings in terms of, reliability and what is being assessed and so on. And so commonly agreed standards, of course, play a really important role in addressing that and making the market's offerings more easily comparable.
Thanks, Florian. Yeah, you make a very important point. The DCRF, so the kind of group of UK regulators that comes together to look at some of these issues, in September last year, published a report where they highlighted the lack of specific rules and standards, and they called it kind of a Wild West patchwork. So I think it's very exciting to hear, some of the efforts to standardize that and the global efforts, but also to hear where we're at in the UK. Felicity, turning specifically to the portfolio, it outlines 3 different approaches of AI assurance that can help organizations to embed those AI principles that were mentioned in the UK AI Whitepaper into existing business processes. So they're technical, procedural, and educational. And just to quickly run through them, technical approaches can include software tools and standards and technical documentation, and aim to address AI-specific issues from a technical angle. The procedural approaches includes guidelines and governance frameworks and risk management tools, and can help with operational and process-related implementation guidance. And then educational approaches include training programs, capacity, and awareness materials to help build awareness and upskill people. I'm interested in asking have you seen a greater focus and investment in one of those areas from some of the submissions to the portfolio? And also what are the main obstacles that are preventing organizations from embedding these principles and these assurance techniques into their business?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think I touched on this a little bit in my previous answer, but we're definitely seeing an increase in sort of technical approaches and the sort of number of SMEs and startups who are able to sort of help firms who want to develop those, and I think that's really exciting. It's a really important sort of part of the landscape. But obviously, we do need that sort of full breadth of techniques to be developed if we're able to sort of deploy AI tools and techniques in a sort of generally assured way. So I think we'll be really looking to promote some of those other aspects of assurance as well. But I think that kind of gets to this point, doesn't it, about this sort of socio-technical approaches and how we verify those, and sort of building the system that sits around that. Sorry, I had a second point there. It's completely sort of dropped from my mind. What was the second part of your question?
The second part was about the main obstacles.
Main obstacles. Sorry about that. So I think one of the main obstacles actually is the skills within organisations that are trying to deploy these and sort of understanding of what assurance and good assurance techniques look like. So again, I think that's something that the portfolio can help with, and certainly that's one of the key issues that we're trying to address.
Thank you. Emre, holistic AI, as we've heard, is obviously at the forefront of the efforts to help empower enterprises to adopt and scale AI quite confidently and build trust. But I'm wondering, from your philosophical lens as well, do you think that companies are indeed able to self-regulate using this kind of nascent AI assurance ecosystem that currently exists and, as you said, also is developing over the next couple of years? Or are you hearing that companies actually would quite like a top-down approach, similar to the EU AI Act's approach in relation to the requirement for conformity assessments?
So I'll indulge the philosophy background. A very well-known company, I won't obviously say who, and we were talking to them saying, we're trying to sell in and whatever, and it's just taking ages and ages. And then eventually somebody called me and said, listen, why don't we just pay you to write these kind of philosophical arguments justifying the use or non-use of a particular system on these super edge cases? And I was like, great in a personal capacity, but that just doesn't work for us as a company. Actually, so the reason why I tell that anecdote is, what does it mean to assure a system? Or what does it mean to have assurance? Am I lending my, I would love to, as I said to them, I would love to be your priest and just stamp something off and tell you what is right and wrong. But actually, we're not lending, if you will, our kind of reputation as academics to say, because I have said so, or because we have said so, this thing is assured. It's very much about the architecture of discovery and observability of what's taking place within the business. So the argument would be that what we should be having as an ecosystem, irrespective of holistic AI, is a regulator might come along and say, okay, you've claimed that this thing is assured. What did you do? So it's really just about providing, what we do as a kind of company is provide the kind of architecture for that kind of observability. So speaking to a very large kind of, you can almost see it's good governance, but done for AI. So, and the problem is, one argues, if you will, the problem is then if there's already these kind of good governance procedures in place, what's the point of doing something specific for AI? And it's because it's just the nature of the technology. So the way we kind of solved as a society the data governance question was very much about kind of forms. It's just people kind of declaring, and you do this DPIA, and then if something doesn't change, you just do it again at some other point. It's just that these systems were just way too complicated and dynamic for some kind of question and answer session, documentation to work. So in a way, I think there's kind of, the way I think about the kind of industry as it emerges is there's analogies and disanalogies to data governance. Insofar it is about the documentation, accountability, where it's being used, who's using it, and so on and so forth. And then it's kind of disanalogous because actually these technologies are way more dynamic and so on. And then there's kind of analogous and disanalogous to cybersecurity. So cybersecurity wasn't really about the way we solve data governance. It wasn't as legalistic, if you will. So it's kind of disanalogous in that respect, but it's analogous insofar as cybersecurity is a very live industry. An incident occurs and then it just kind of goes across and so on and so forth. So it is a kind of industry in itself. You'll be pleased to hear when I pitch to the VCs, I'm telling them this is the next thing. We had cybersecurity, we had data governance, and now we've got kind of whatever this thing is going to be called, let's say AI governance or assurance. But that's the kind of, it's not about, it's really about if someone does a good job, I'm sure a reasonable regulator will be able to come along and say, look, they've got observability across the business, they're registering the use of these systems, they've got good protections in place, there's kind of a taxonomy of accountability, there's kind of continuous monitoring for high-risk systems, they've done reasonable assessments of particular kinds of technical verticals, and so on and so forth. So really, in a sense, kind of good governance in a very technical context is really kind of what we're really about, the kind of architecture of how you create that kind of evidence, or that kind of, if you will, structure in place where you've got good governance in place for AI.
And just, sorry, Rob, while you were talking really made me think of sort of some of the other issues that we do hear from firms. And I think this point about being able to communicate the trustworthiness of your system and being able to sort of point to, not only have I done this assurance, but actually my assurance is robust and it's got X sort of tick mark or sort of recognition. And I think what's interesting, because you obviously referred to that in a regulatory context, but it's not always it is not always just about sort of regulatory compliance. It might be, and I think there are opportunities for firms here if we can get that sort of certification and sort of measurement right, to sort of really sort of own the market and say, well, my product is very sort of highly trustworthy. It's very, very highly verifiable. And so it's not just about sort of, yes, I comply with regulations. It's actually, I'm sort of really building something that works for my customers and sort of meets meets their challenges. But I think it's really sort of interesting, sort of talking about how this might kind of what we might learn from data and what we might learn from cyber. But I mean, this is really sort of goes hand in hand with the story of innovation. I don't know if anyone listens to the You're Dead to Me podcast. It's a really excellent podcast if you don't. And they had a fascinating episode on the history of chocolate. And it turns out that famous chocolate manufacturer, others are available, Cadbury's, was really pushing on the regulator to make companies publish their ingredients lists, because they used 100% cocoa and they didn't think that anyone else did. So then they could be like, oh, well, it's pure, so it's the best. And the regulators sort of bought the argument that they needed to publish their ingredients list, and it really helped them to capture market share. So I think that there is this kind of question about sort of how we use assurance to really sort of demonstrate what it is that's really good about a product, and think about sort of safety as part of that sort of strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. I know Florian, I don't want to think,
Sorry.
but just we've seen that. So we very much kind of work with enterprise, but actually the vendors are coming to us and saying, hey, there's a lot of snake oil in the market, and we want to show that we're not.
Yeah.
So they just come along and say, look, we'd be desperate to actually do it. If someone wants to be audited, they're probably not a bad player.
And then there's the whole...
You can imagine why. Yeah.
And then there's the level above the audit, which is kind of the professionalizing the assurance ecosystem. So obviously Holistic AI has got a head start here, but at some point there's going to be a conversation about accreditation and certification. And so that's a whole nother area that we could explore. But Florian, I want to get to a final question for you before hopefully we'll have time for maybe one audience question. The Alan Turing Institute, obviously in partnership with the British Standards and National Physical Laboratory, are leading the UK's AI Standards Hub, which is championing the use of standards to ensure common ground between both providers of assurance and the safety tech world itself. So the UK's AI Whitepaper aims to balance safety with innovation, and there's a lot of discussion right now on the world stage about whether you take a pro-innovation approach like the UK and like the US, or whether you're thinking about safety like the EU and also to a certain degree China. And so Florian, I wondered whether you thought that a more innovation-friendly approach would help to encourage adoption of AI standards and assurance techniques. And if so, kind of how are you at Turing trying to shape that conversation between safety and innovation?
Yeah, thank you. So I think as a first initial response, I would say, from our perspective, and I think it's probably shared also based on Felicity's comments and Emre's comments just now, we shouldn't think of safety as being in tension with innovation, I think. So, there's an obvious point about the long term. If you can't achieve AI safety in the long term, there won't be any sustainable AI adoption and long-term sort of progress in the field. But also in the short term, we're already seeing, significant concern about safety issues. We're seeing increasing complexity of AI supply chains. That means that different supply chain actors need to, be able to trust what's being passed down the supply chain in order to be able to make use of that to innovate and so on. So I think it's not so much a contrast between pro-safety and versus pro-innovation approaches, but it is, of course, thinking about how can we ensure safety without sort of unnecessarily stifling innovation. And I think there are two features to the UK approach that stand out in that respect. If you compare it, for example, to the EU approach, there is the first contrast around taking an approach that starts, from the perspective of sector-specific regulators or existing regulators, on the premise of a twofold premise, I think. Firstly, the view that existing regulators are particularly well placed to understand the risks and the impact of AI in a particular context, but also that it's really important for any new forms of AI governance mechanisms that are being introduced, for them to be coherent with existing regulation that is already out there. Of course, that particularly applies to highly regulated sectors such as financial services and medical devices, for example. And so existing regulators are much better placed to make sure that there is that coherence with existing regulators compared to sort of a more cross-cutting, I think, centralized approach. So I think that's one important feature of trying to be pro-innovation and making sure that regulation is as coherent and as consolidated as it can be. Then the second element is this emphasis on standards, I think, and other tools to help facilitate the implementation of regulatory objectives. And I'll just say a few more words about standards in particular. So I think there are two reasons, to think that standards are a really important and useful tool to ensure that regulation and the governance approaches are as supportive of innovation as they can be. The first one is that standards, although standards development, of course, takes time as well. They aren't developed overnight. They can be more agile and more flexible compared to regulatory rules that are being set in stone either through legislation or passed through regulatory rule books. So we know that once regulatory rules are established, there is a certain it's not that easy for them to change or be updated over time. So standards, in contrast, have built in typically sort of a review process for them to be updated and reviewed by the relevant committee after a certain period. So that sort of agility and updating is an important feature. And then the other feature is I think the range of expertise that standards development processes draw on or can draw on. That's much wider than the forms of expertise that typically feed into the development of regulatory rulemaking or legislation. So standards development as a multi-stakeholder process that's open for any interested stakeholder to feed in to make sure that their perspectives are represented. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, that shouldn't be taken for granted. So for standards to play that role effectively, it's really important to achieve that inclusiveness in the development, and that's again part of what we're trying to achieve with the AI Standards Hub. And if any of you are interested, in the audience to find out more about how to get actively involved, I'd like to invite you to take a look at our resources. But if that can be achieved, then standards can really be value adding and make a difference as opposed to an approach that purely relies on regulatory rulemaking.
Thank you. And time is against us, sadly, but I'd like to maybe pose a closing question to each of you, which is reflecting on everything that we've discussed. Could you each kind of share one key action or initiative that you believe should be prioritized in the kind of near to medium term to ensure both the successful implementation of the AI principles outlined in the white paper and the adoption of trustworthy AI, but also the growth and kind of bolstering of this nascent UK AI assurance ecosystem and market? Felicity?
Well, I mean, it has to be coming together, collaborating, and sort of sharing what good practice is. It is very much behind what we've been doing with the portfolio of techniques. But I think that what makes AI different is the complexity of it and the number of sort of different players that need to be involved. And the way that we will be successful is if industry, regulators, and government are working closely together. But I think to Florian's point as well, that sort of international collaboration, so we can really develop interoperable approaches to assurance that will help UK companies sell their products and services overseas as well.
Thank you.
I'll just maybe to remember that it's we as a country, our universities produce the best IP in the world, zero doubt. I'm about 10 minutes from Stanford. There's just what we were doing at UCL was just as cutting edge. In many ways, it's no surprise that DeepMind came out of our department. So it's to understand that what we're doing ultimately is about the AI kind of revolution, the industrial revolution that's happening, and actually it makes complete sense that the governance is coming out of the same ecosystem that's producing the kind of innovation excellence. So for me, it's just very much to be cognizant of the fact that we're world leading in terms of innovation and IP generation and technology, and that actually it's not they innovate and we regulate or create the standards and so on, but actually it's going to come from within the same kind of fulcrum, if you will.
Thank you. Florian?
Thank you. I agree with all of those points. I was also going to make a point about interoperability, at the regulatory and governance level. I think especially also thinking about what's happening at the EU level. Today, some of you may be aware, is an important day in the EU AI Act negotiations. I think there'll be important questions, for the UK and anyone in the assurance ecosystem to think about. There'll be a rapidly evolving assurance ecosystem, or as it were, a boost to the development on that side for the EU once the AI Act is passed, and how will those developments relate to the developments in the UK. But then maybe to go back to, I think, a point that Felicity made, I think capacity and resourcing is also really key, across all relevant types of organizations. So capacity building in organizations that are developing AI, that may be in the business of procuring systems, but have very little understanding of the technical aspects of AI development. I think it's really important for procurers to have sufficient understanding to judge what responsible procurement entails for themselves, and then also for regulators. I mean, it's quite clear that in the white paper, with the tasks that are given to the existing regulators, there are significant capacity building sort of needs that will determine the success of the approach.
Thank you. I'm hearing kind of you're all speaking this in the same voice, I think, which is really interesting. And I think I wanted to note, but just before we ended, that the AI skills gap is broadening, and particularly for groups that are actually underrepresented. The Alan Turing Institute put out a report last year that said only 22% of people in AI roles are women. And what I'm hearing about this collaborative effort that we need to do between industry and government and regulators, and also about the need for interoperability and collaboration and inclusivity, I think it's important to note that having a skilled and diverse community will hopefully drive the change that we want to see, and also a more innovative and a more accountable and a more responsible technology and market. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you so much to my panelists, to Felicity, to Emre, and to Florian, and I hope we can all have a nice lunch.